Rising from the North Carolina foothills, just outside the town of Morganton, stands a building most drivers barely notice anymore. Its red brick has darkened with more than a century of rain and wood smoke. Its windows, hundreds of them, catch the afternoon light in a way that almost looks warm, almost looks inviting. But those who have worked inside its oldest wings tell a different story. They speak of hallways that feel colder than they should, of a silence so heavy it presses against the chest, of rooms where the past seems to linger long after the people who suffered there have gone. This is Broughton Hospital, and for nearly 150 years, it has stood as one of the oldest psychiatric institutions in the American South. It was born from genuine compassion and a promise that the mentally ill deserve dignity instead of chains. But behind the stately facade and the manicured lawns and soaring ceilings meant to soothe troubled minds, a darker story was taking shape. Overcrowding, barbaric treatments carried out in the name of science, families who left loved ones behind and never returned, deaths that were never fully explained. Former staff and visitors still describe an oppressive stillness in the hospital's oldest corridors, as if the line between hope and suffering had worn dangerously thin. Chapter 1: A Reformer's Crusade and the Asylum's Opening. In the middle of the 1800s, the United States had no real answer for what to do with people suffering from mental illness. Those who could not care for themselves were often locked away in jails alongside criminals, or abandoned in poorhouses meant for the destitute and elderly. Some were kept in cellars and outbuildings by their own families, chained to walls or hidden from neighbors out of shame. There were no hospitals built for their care, no trained physicians who understood the mind, and almost no public sympathy for their suffering. Madness, as it was called then, was treated as a moral failing rather than an illness, something to be hidden rather than healed. Into this bleak landscape stepped a schoolteacher from Massachusetts named Dorothea Dix. Dix had spent years touring jails and almshouses across the northeastern United States, documenting what she found with her own eyes. She saw men and women kept in cages. She saw patients beaten, starved, and left without clothing in the depths of winter. She turned her observations into a relentless campaign, petitioning lawmakers to build proper asylums where the mentally ill could receive humane treatment. It was a radical idea for its time, the notion that people suffering from these conditions deserved not punishment, but care. Her efforts succeeded, and North Carolina opened its first psychiatric institution in the state capital not long after. But North Carolina in the 1800s was a large and difficult place to navigate, where steep mountains and poor roads made travel to the capital nearly impossible for many families. As the years passed, it became painfully clear that a single hospital could not serve the entire state. Patients from the western counties often could not reach the existing facility at all, and those who could face journeys of several days over rough terrain, sometimes arriving in worse condition than when they left home. By the 1870s, calls grew louder for a second institution, one that could serve the mountain communities of western North Carolina without demanding such an impossible journey. In 1875, the General Assembly finally responded, approving $75,000 to establish a second psychiatric hospital in the western part of the state. The town chosen for this new institution was Morganton, a quiet foothill community with access to rail lines and enough open land to accommodate an ambitious building project. The site selected sprawled across roughly 283 acres, rolling countryside framed by distant mountain ridges, the kind of setting that reformers of the era believed could itself become part of the healing process. The architectural philosophy guiding institutions like this one held that the environment surrounding a patient mattered just as much as any medicine or treatment. Sunlight, fresh air, symmetry, and quiet natural beauty were thought to calm troubled minds in ways that confinement in a dark cell never could. The architect chosen for the project was Samuel Sloan, a well-regarded designer of the era, known for his work on public buildings throughout the country. Sloan's design called for a massive central structure with long, extending wings, built along principles popular among asylum architects of the period. Principles that emphasize natural light pouring through tall windows and long corridors, meant to feel less like a prison and more like a retreat. Construction began in the late 1870s and continued for several years, an enormous undertaking for a rural town of that size. The building rose slowly, its scale becoming more apparent to locals with each passing season. Many in the surrounding community had never seen anything so large built so far from a major city, and rumors and curiosity followed the project throughout its construction. Finally, after years of labor and anticipation, the doors opened on the 29th of March, 1883. It was named the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum, a title that reflected both its purpose and the blunt, unsentimental language of its time. For the families who had waited years for a facility closer to home, the opening represented something close to a miracle. No longer would loved ones need to endure days of travel over mountain roads. No longer would they be forced into jails or hidden away in back rooms for lack of any other option. According to local lore passed down through generations of hospital staff, the very first patient admitted through those doors was a physician himself, a man whose colorful nickname, Dr. Red Pepper, has survived in hospital folklore long after his actual identity faded from memory. Whether the story is entirely accurate or has been softened and embellished over generations of retelling, it captures something true about the asylum's earliest days, an institution stepping into uncharted territory, uncertain exactly who would walk through its doors or what their stories would be. In those opening months, the hospital represented the very best of what Gilded Age reform believed itself capable of achieving. The wide hallways caught the morning sun. The grounds stretched toward the mountains in every direction, quiet and green. Physicians spoke with genuine hope about restoring patients to health and eventually returning them to their families and communities. It must have felt like an unambiguous triumph, a beautiful brick monument to human progress rising from the North Carolina hills. No one standing on the lawn that spring in 1883 could have imagined the population, numbers the hospital would one day be forced to absorb, or the treatments that would one day be carried out within its walls, treatments that history would eventually judge far more harshly than anyone in that founding generation could have anticipated. For now, though, in the earliest days of the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum, there was only cautious optimism, the sense of a genuine problem finally being addressed, and a building so ambitious in scale that it seemed built to last forever. Chapter 2: The Colony Years. The man tasked with turning this ambitious brick shell into a functioning hospital was Dr. Patrick Livingston Murphy, appointed as the asylum's first superintendent. Murphy inherited a building full of promise, but almost no established routine, no proven system for the daily realities of caring for hundreds of patients at once. Within the first year of operation, he reported back to the General Assembly with a message that would become a familiar refrain throughout the hospital's history. More space was desperately needed. The demand for admission had outpaced even the founder's most ambitious projections. Families from across the western counties arrived at the asylum's gates almost as soon as it opened, and the wards filled far faster than anyone had anticipated. In response, the hospital expanded rapidly. By 1885 and 1886, 2 new wings had opened, pushing the institution's capacity to more than 500 patients. Each new wing meant more brick, more wards, more staff, and more of the daily labor required to keep such a sprawling institution running. In 1890, the hospital took on a new name, becoming known simply as the State Hospital at Morganton, a title it would carry for nearly 70 years. This period marked what many historians consider the institution's confident, expansive era. By 1893, the hospital's total landholdings had grown past 300 acres, an enormous footprint for what had begun as a single ambitious building project a decade earlier. In the years that followed, this expansion took on a distinct shape known as the colony system, an approach to institutional life that blurred the line between hospital and self-sufficient village. Patients considered capable of physical labor were put to work constructing roads across the property, tending vegetable gardens, and maintaining the sprawling grounds that stretched in every direction from the original building. The hospital established a working dairy, staffed largely by patients under supervision. On the surface, this colony system was framed as therapeutic, a form of moral treatment that kept patients occupied, connected to purposeful work, and less isolated within the confines of their wards. Physicians of the era believed that labor in the fresh air, tending crops, or working alongside dairy cattle could calm troubled minds in ways that confinement indoors never could. For some patients, this labor likely did provide structure and a sense of purpose that had been entirely absent from institutional life elsewhere. But the arrangement also served a far more practical function for the hospital itself. Patient labor kept operating costs remarkably low, allowing the institution to feed itself, maintain its own grounds, and expand its land holdings without matching increases in staff or spending. It was a hospital built to sustain itself on the backs of the very people it was meant to be healing, a contradiction that would only grow more visible as the decades wore on. Throughout the 1890s and into the early 1900s, expansion continued at a steady pace. New buildings rose across the property, additional acreage was purchased, and the institution's reputation grew alongside its physical footprint. To outside observers, and likely to many of the physicians and administrators working within its walls, this must have felt like proof of concept, a demonstration that the moral treatment philosophy championed decades earlier could actually work at scale. The hospital was growing because it needed to grow, because families across Western North Carolina continued sending loved ones through its gates, trusting that this sprawling brick campus in the foothills could offer something better than what had come before. Growth continued largely unchecked until the years surrounding the First World War, when public attitudes toward mental illness and its treatment began to shift in ways that would prove far less favorable to institutions built on this scale. Chapter 3: Cracks Beneath the Surface. The years surrounding the First World War marked a turning point for institutions like the State Hospital at Morganton, though not in the direction its founders had hoped. Public attention and public funding, once so readily available for the grand project of Asylum building, began shifting elsewhere. The optimism of the Gilded Age gave way to a more indifferent, transactional view of institutions like this one. Mental illness was no longer a fashionable cause for reform-minded legislators. Instead, it became a line item to be managed as cheaply as possible, tucked away in a budget that grew more strained with each passing year. The consequences of this shift became painfully visible in the numbers. Through the 1920s, the ratio of patients to physicians at the hospital stood at roughly 300 to 1, an almost unimaginable burden for any single doctor to carry. By the 1930s, that number had grown even worse, climbing to nearly 500 patients for every physician on staff. Behind these figures were real consequences for real people. Doctors stretched so thin, they could offer only the briefest attention to each patient under their care, conditions going unnoticed or untreated simply because there were not enough trained eyes to catch them in time. The burden fell just as heavily on the hospital's attendants and nurses, the staff members responsible for the daily, hands-on work of running the wards. Hours were long and relentless, with little meaningful time off built into the schedule. In a detail that captures just how thin the line had become between caretaker and captive, many attendants during this era slept in the very same wards as their patients, sharing the same cramped, overcrowded spaces night after night, simply because there was nowhere else for them to rest. The building that had once been celebrated for its spacious wings and abundant natural light was now stretched far beyond anything its original architects had imagined, its promise of dignity and space collapsing under the sheer weight of demand. Then came the Great Depression, a financial crisis that struck institutions like this one especially hard. State budgets across the country contracted sharply throughout the 1930s, and mental hospitals, already operating on thin margins and outdated infrastructure, found themselves among the first casualties of austerity. Funding for staff, maintenance, and basic upkeep dried up at precisely the moment the hospital's population was continuing to climb. Wards built decades earlier for far smaller numbers of patients were pressed into service well beyond their intended capacity, buildings sagging under both the physical strain of overcrowding and the financial strain of a state government with little left to spare. By the 1940s, the hospital's total patient census had swelled to more than 3,500 individuals. The self-sufficient colony system that once seemed like proof of the institution's ingenuity now looked more like a survival mechanism, a way of keeping an overwhelmed hospital functioning on the cheapest terms possible. Vineyards and dairies that had once represented therapeutic purpose now simply kept costs down for an institution stretched to its breaking point. What had begun as a monument to reform and progress had become something closer to a warehouse. Its halls crowded far beyond any standard of humane care its founders would have recognized. The gap between the hospital's founding ideals and its daily reality had never been wider, and it was against this backdrop of overcrowding and neglect that some of the institution's darkest chapters would soon unfold. Chapter 4: A Hidden Legacy. Beneath the overcrowding, underfunding, long hours, and thinning ratio of doctors to patients, there existed a far quieter and far more troubling chapter in the hospital's history. It began with an idea that, in the early decades of the 20th century, was not considered fringe or extreme at all. Eugenics, the belief that the human population could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce, had taken hold not just in Germany or in isolated corners of American thought, but in the mainstream of American science and public policy. Universities taught it, state governments legislated it, and North Carolina built an official program around it. In 1929, the North Carolina General Assembly passed its first sterilization law, though courts later struck it down for lacking any real process of appeal. In 1933, lawmakers responded by creating the Eugenics Board of North Carolina, a body granted legal authority to approve the sterilization of individuals deemed unfit to reproduce. The definition of unfit was left disturbingly broad. It came to include people diagnosed with schizophrenia and other forms of mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities, and as the decades wore on, people whose only real offense was poverty, or a family history that caseworkers found troubling, or simply being poor and without the means to advocate for themselves. Patients housed within state institutions, including the hospital in Morganton, were especially vulnerable to these decisions. Their fates are often determined not by their own physicians alone, but by a distant board reviewing case files and signing off on procedures the patients themselves may never have fully understood or consented to. From the 1930s through the 1970s, this program operated with the full backing of state law. Over the course of more than 4 decades, more than 7,600 North Carolinians were sterilized under its authority, a number that placed North Carolina among the most aggressive practitioners of eugenics anywhere in the country. Many of those affected passed through institutions like the one in Morganton at some point during their lives, their medical records marked with recommendations and approvals that reduced deeply personal, irreversible decisions to bureaucratic paperwork. There was no courtroom drama to these decisions, no dramatic confrontation between doctor and patient. Instead, there was only the quiet machinery of a state board, meeting on a schedule, reviewing files, and signing forms that would permanently alter the course of a person's life, often without that person fully understanding what was happening to them or why. This is perhaps what makes this chapter of the hospital's history so unsettling. Not the presence of any single villain or dramatic act of cruelty, but the ordinary procedural nature of the harm itself. Decisions of enormous consequence were made in meeting rooms, discussed in the clinical language of case files and recommendations, carried out not by monsters, but by officials who genuinely believed they were acting in the best interest of the state and even of the patients themselves. For decades, this history remained buried, tucked into medical archives and state records that few outside the system ever thought to examine. It was not until years later, as historians and journalists began piecing together the full scope of the program, that the true numbers came to light and the public began to reckon with what had been done under the authority of the state. In 2002, Governor Mike Easley issued a formal apology on behalf of North Carolina, acknowledging the harm done to thousands of its citizens through the eugenics program, and making North Carolina one of only a small number of states to formally apologize for these practices. It was a moment of accountability, though one that arrived decades too late for many of those affected. For the hospital in Morganton, this history adds a somber tone, one that rarely appears on historical markers or in the brief summaries offered to visitors. The wards where patients once slept and the offices where staff once reviewed case files carry no outward sign of this particular chapter. But it remains part of the institution's past nonetheless, a reminder that harm does not always announce itself with cruelty or violence. Sometimes it arrives instead in the quiet, procedural language of forms and approvals, in decisions made far from the people whose lives they would permanently change. A chapter that shaped the hospital's legacy, just as surely as the dramatic tragedies still to come. Chapter 5. Renamed, Rebranded. In 1959, after more than 7 decades operating under the name State Hospital at Morganton, the institution was renamed once again. This time, it became Broughton Hospital, honoring Joseph Melville Broughton, the former governor of North Carolina, who had led the state through the years of the Second World War. The new name carried a sense of fresh identity, a suggestion that the institution was entering a different era, one defined less by the raw survival mode of the Depression years and more by a renewed effort at legitimate psychiatric care. Whether the name change reflected genuine internal transformation or simply a public relations effort to distance the hospital from its recent past is a question historians still debate. What is certain is that the treatments practiced within Broughton's walls during this period would come to be viewed by the medical profession itself as deeply flawed, even barbaric. Hydrotherapy, which involves submerging or wrapping patients in water at carefully controlled temperatures for extended periods, was employed as a calming technique for those considered dangerously agitated. Electroshock therapy, delivering controlled electrical currents through the brain to induce seizures, was used widely across psychiatric institutions of the era, often without the refined safeguards, anesthesia, or informed consent procedures that would later become standard practice. Insulin shock therapy, a treatment that induced comas through carefully measured insulin doses, was believed by many physicians of the time to offer genuine therapeutic benefit for patients suffering from severe psychiatric conditions. And lobotomies, surgical procedures that severed connections within the brain's frontal lobes, were performed on patients considered otherwise untreatable, a practice that decades later would be widely condemned as one of the most damaging chapters in the history of American psychiatry. At the time, physicians defending these methods genuinely believed they represented the cutting edge of medical science. Viewed through the lens of history, however, these treatments now stand as some of the clearest evidence of how far the field of psychiatry still had to travel before it could claim to be practicing modern, humane medicine. Despite this troubling backdrop, the 1960s did bring meaningful change to Broughton Hospital. Educational programs were established for patients, offering structured learning opportunities that had never before been part of institutional life on this scale. Religious services were incorporated into the weekly rhythm of the hospital, providing patients with spiritual community and a sense of continuity with the world outside the wards. The hospital continued to expand its reach as well, forming affiliations with local community health centers scattered across the surrounding region, part of a broader national effort during this era to move mental health treatment away from massive, isolated institutions and towards smaller, more localized settings, closer to where patients actually lived. This movement reflected a growing recognition across the country that warehousing thousands of patients within a single sprawling campus was neither humane nor effective, a recognition that had arrived far too late for the countless patients who had already spent decades within Broughton's overcrowded wards. The 1970s brought further structural change. For nearly a century, patients admitted to Broughton had been housed according to where they came from, geographically, grouped by home county or region, rather than by their actual age, condition, or specific medical needs. During this decade, hospital administrators finally began moving away from this outdated system, restructuring how patients were placed within the institution in ways meant to better serve their individual circumstances rather than simply their point of origin. This shift represented a quiet but meaningful acknowledgement that the hospital's internal systems, inherited largely unchanged from the 1800s, needed genuine modernization if Broughton hoped to keep pace with evolving standards of psychiatric care. On the 28th of March, 1973, Broughton Hospital received its first formal survey from the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, a review process that measured the hospital against national standards for safety, staffing, and quality of care. The hospital received a 1-year accreditation, a modest but symbolically important milestone, evidence that Broughton was at last being measured against the same benchmarks applied to hospitals across the country, rather than judged solely on its own internal, insular standards. Yet, even as Broughton worked to reshape its public image and modernize its practices, the institution's oldest wings still held decades of accumulated history within their walls, history that included treatments now condemned by modern medicine and darker events still waiting to unfold behind Broughton's locked doors. Chapter 6: The Ward R Tragedy. By the early 1970s, Broughton Hospital had weathered nearly a century of overcrowding, quiet institutional cruelty, and slow, uneven reform. But nothing in its long history would leave as lasting or as unsettling a mark on staff memory as what unfolded within Ward R on a spring morning in 1971. It remains one of the most talked about and least understood chapters in the hospital's entire story. A tragedy that occurred not among patients, but among the very people entrusted with their care. The two people at the center of this story were well-known figures within the hospital's daily operations. Dr. Paul Douglas Boyles was a 37-year-old psychiatrist on staff, a man trusted with the treatment and oversight of patients within his ward. Betty Cheek Yarborough was a 39-year-old nurse administrator, a respected figure among her colleagues, responsible for coordinating much of the daily nursing operations within the same section of the hospital. Both were fixtures of Ward R, the kind of staff members whose presence shaped the daily rhythm of institutional life. On the morning of the 22nd of April, 1971, staff members recalled seeing the two enter the nurses' station together at around 7:30 in the morning, an unremarkable moment at first glance, simply two colleagues beginning another day inside the ward. Co-workers nearby reported hearing some kind of commotion coming from within the station shortly after the two entered, followed by an unsettling silence that stretched on long enough to alarm those working close by. When hospital staff finally forced the door open, they discovered a scene that would haunt Broughton's institutional memory for decades to come. Dr. Boyles was found dead of a stab wound. Nurse Yarborough was found gravely injured, though still alive when staff reached her. She was rushed for emergency treatment, but died roughly 1 hour later, her injuries too severe to overcome. In the immediate aftermath, confusion spread quickly through the hospital and the surrounding community. Early speculation swirled in every direction. Some believed Yarborough had been the one to attack Boyles. Others whispered of a romantic affair between the two, one that had perhaps ended in a moment of violence neither had anticipated. For a time, the true sequence of events remained maddeningly unclear, the kind of ambiguity that tends to breed rumor in the absence of solid answers. Eventually, official findings brought at least a partial resolution to the speculation. The Burke County Medical Examiner ruled Betty Yarborough's death a homicide and Paul Boyles' death as self-inflicted. Findings that suggested Boyles had fatally attacked Yarborough before the encounter also ended his own life. Yet, even with this official ruling, the deeper questions lingered, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. No motive was ever made public. No detailed account of what led to that morning's violence was ever released to staff, to the press, or to the broader public. What remained was simply the stark, undeniable fact that two respected members of Broughton's staff, people trusted with the well-being of vulnerable patients, had died violently within a locked room meant for the quiet administrative work of running a hospital ward. The tragedy sent ripples through the surrounding community as well. Newspapers across the region carried headlines about the deaths in the days that followed, transforming what might have remained a quiet, internal hospital matter into a story that captured public attention far beyond Morganton's borders. For the staff who continued working at Broughton in the years after, the events of that April morning became something rarely discussed openly, yet impossible to fully forget. A story that lived on in hushed conversations and cautionary references passed down to newer employees who had never known Boyles or Yarborough themselves. In the years that followed, the area surrounding the old nurses' station in Ward R took on a reputation of its own among longtime staff members. Some described hearing what sounded like angry raised voices coming from behind closed office doors, only to open them and find the rooms completely empty. Others noted an unexplained drop in temperature near old filing cabinets in the area, cabinets that some believed had once stored records related to the tragedy itself. A number of staff members over the years described glimpsing shadowy figures moving briefly through the space, one said to resemble a man in a white lab coat, another resembling a woman in a nurse's uniform, always vanishing before anyone could get a clear look. Whether there is anything genuinely unexplained behind these accounts, or whether they are simply a tragic story retold and embellished across generations of hospital staff, is impossible to say with certainty. What can be said is that the emotional weight of that April morning never fully lifted from Ward R. Decades later, current and former employees still describe the area as carrying a heaviness distinct from the rest of the building, as though something from that day remained unresolved within its walls. In an institution already burdened by so much history, the events of 1971 added an entirely different kind of darkness, one rooted not in systemic neglect, but in a single morning of violence whose true cause may never be fully known. Chapter 7. The Twins Who Died Together. Nearly a decade before the tragedy in Ward R, Broughton Hospital had already faced another death that defied easy explanation, one quieter than the violence of 1971, but no less unsettling to those who witnessed it. In April of 1962, two patients at Broughton became the center of a mystery that remains unresolved. Bobby Jean Eller and Betty Jo Eller were identical twin sisters, both 31 years old, who had spent years living with schizophrenia. Born as part of a set of triplets, only the two sisters had survived infancy, and the bond between them had grown unusually intense over the course of their lives, a closeness that staff at Broughton had come to view with some concern. Hospital staff had come to believe that the sisters' relationship had grown unhealthy in its intensity, with one twin appearing to exert a dominating influence over the other. In an effort to help both women, staff made the decision to separate the sisters, placing them in different wards of the hospital, a choice made with therapeutic intentions, but one that would precede a devastating and inexplicable loss. The separation took place just one day before tragedy struck. Early the following morning, staff discovered that one of the twins had died in her sleep. Word of the death spread quickly through the ward, and a staff member, likely searching for some way to inform the surviving sister, rushed to check on her in the separate ward where she had been placed. What that staff member found defied easy explanation. The second twin was also dead, having passed away in her own bed at what appeared to be roughly the same time as her sister, in a completely different part of the hospital, with no way for either woman to have known what had happened to the other. Physicians and investigators searched for a medical explanation for what had occurred. Autopsies were performed on both women, yet revealed no anatomical cause of death, no sign of trauma, no indication of any physical ailment that might explain why two seemingly healthy women had died within hours, if not minutes, of one another. Toxicology reports were reviewed as well. Both sisters had been prescribed medication as part of their ongoing psychiatric care, yet nothing in the toxicology findings suggested an overdose or any drug-related cause for their deaths. The medical explanation, in the end, simply was not there. Faced with this absence of any clear physical cause, Burke County's coroner at the time, Dr. John C. Reese, offered a theory that leaned as much on psychiatric folklore as it did on established medical science. He suggested that the women may have willed themselves to die, a phenomenon he believed had precedent among patients suffering from severe psychotic conditions. Speaking to reporters at the time, Reese noted that some psychiatrists believed certain schizophrenic patients could develop what he described as a will not to live, and that the timing of the twins' deaths, separated by mere hours despite being kept in entirely different parts of the hospital, might reflect some deeper, unexplainable connection between the sisters that medicine of that era simply had no framework to understand. The story of the Eller twins faded from newspaper headlines within weeks, overtaken by other news and other concerns. But among longtime Broughton staff and local historians who have studied the hospital's past, the strange timing of their deaths has never entirely faded from memory. In the ward where Bobby Jean died, some patients in later years described noticing a small, glowing blue light outside the dayroom windows, flickering faintly through the trees at night. Others spoke of feeling an unseen presence tugging at an ankle or pushing gently at a shoulder while lying in bed, Incidents some staff came to attribute, half seriously and half in comfort, to the twins continuing some harmless mischief from beyond the walls that had once separated them in life. Chapter 8: The Cemetery of Forgotten Names. Beyond the wards and the wings, beyond the offices where staff once reviewed case files and the wings where treatments now considered barbaric were once carried out, Broughton's grounds hold one more place that speaks to the institution's long and complicated history. Behind the main hospital building lies a quiet cemetery, opened in the spring of 1883. The very same year, the asylum first welcomed patients through its doors. By the following year, the burial ground had already been enclosed by a simple fence, a modest gesture toward permanence for a section of the property that would, over the coming century, come to hold the remains of more than 1,500 people. For many of these individuals, burial at the asylum was not a matter of abandonment, though that assumption has followed the cemetery for generations. The hospital's catchment area stretched across the entire western reach of North Carolina, extending high into the mountains and touching the borders of Virginia, Tennessee, and South Carolina. For families living at such distances, transporting a loved one's remains home by train or by wagon was often simply not possible, whether due to the cost involved or the sheer difficulty of the journey itself. Other patients had spent so many years in the hospital's care that they had no surviving family left to claim them, or had come, after decades within its walls, to consider the institution itself their true home. Still others died during seasons when weather made travel treacherous or impossible, leaving burial on hospital grounds as the only practical option available at the time. One figure shaped the character of this cemetery more than any other. Dr. Patrick Livingston Murphy, the asylum's first superintendent, made a decision early in his tenure that would define how the institution treated its dead for decades to come. Murphy refused to allow the remains of any patient to be handed over to the North Carolina Anatomical Board for dissection or disposal, a practice that was a common fate for the unclaimed bodies of the poor and institutionalized across the country. Murphy insisted instead that if a family could not provide for a proper burial, the asylum itself would take on that responsibility. It was a quiet but meaningful act of dignity, offered to patients whose lives had often been defined by the absence of exactly that. For decades, however, this dignity remained incomplete. Many of the graves within the cemetery were marked not with names, but with simple numbers, a practical system for record keeping that nonetheless stripped away the individual identity of each person buried there. Visitors walking the grounds for much of the 20th century would have seen row after row of small, anonymous markers, evidence of lives that had ended within the hospital's care, but left behind no public trace of who these people had actually been. This began to change only in the final years of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st. Chaplains and volunteers connected to the hospital took on the painstaking work of researching hospital records, cross-referencing burial numbers with admission files and family histories, in an effort to restore names to as many graves as possible. Slowly, nameplates began to replace the anonymous numbers that had marked the cemetery for so long, each new name representing hours of careful research and a small act of restored dignity for someone who had been forgotten by the wider world for the better part of a century. Today, every grave within the cemetery is marked, and every person buried there is known, a distinction not every asylum cemetery in the country can claim. It stands as one of the few places on Broughton's grounds where the institution's original promise, dignity, even in suffering, was ultimately kept, even if it took more than 100 years to fully honor that promise. Chapter 9: Hauntings and the Weight of Memory. Given everything that unfolded within Broughton's walls across nearly a century and a half, it is perhaps no surprise that Broughton Hospital has developed a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in North Carolina. Whether these stories reflect something genuinely unexplained, or simply the natural residue of trauma passed down through generations of staff, they have become as much a part of Broughton's identity as its brick facade and its long medical history. Among the most persistent stories told by staff over the years involves an elevator within one of the hospital's older sections, one said to occasionally operate on its own, stopping at floors where no one is waiting to board. Employees working late shifts have described hearing faint, shuffling footsteps from within the elevator car itself. Footsteps that seem to belong to no one. Some have reported glimpsing a figure inside, a woman dressed in clothing that seems to belong to an earlier era. The apparition, as the story goes, is believed by some to be a former patient or staff member, though her identity has never been confirmed. What makes this particular story notable is its consistency across decades. New sightings reported not by a single source, but by different staff members working different shifts across many years. Each account echoing details reported long before by people who had never spoken to one another. Elsewhere in the hospital's older wings, particularly in areas once used for treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, staff and visitors alike have described hearing disembodied voices during the quiet hours of the night. Investigators who have spent time in these spaces have described capturing what sound like faint screams, murmurs, or fragments of speech with no clear source. Employees working night shifts over the years have described hearing what sounded like distant screaming coming from buildings that stood completely empty. Sounds unsettling enough that police were called out on at least one occasion to investigate a building that revealed no one inside. Beneath the hospital itself lies another source of long-standing legend. A network of underground tunnels originally built to allow staff to move patients discreetly between different wards without navigating the weather or the more public hallways above ground. These tunnels have long since been sealed off from regular use, yet they remain a frequent subject of stories passed between staff and paranormal investigators alike. Visitors who have explored the tunnels in the years before their sealing described sudden cold drafts moving through the corridors, flickering lights with no clear electrical cause, and an unshakable sensation of being watched from somewhere just out of sight. Perhaps the most visually striking piece of Broughton folklore involves a particular window on the hospital's third floor, one that was eventually boarded up entirely after years of reported sightings. According to local accounts, drivers passing along the nearby highway reported seeing the silhouette of a woman standing in the window with such regularity that hospital administrators eventually chose to seal it rather than continue fielding questions and concerns from the surrounding community. The figure is said to be connected to a patient who, according to hospital lore, took her own life in a stairwell decades earlier, her presence lingering in the window nearest to where her life ended. Whatever the truth behind any of these individual stories, taken together, they reflect something undeniably real about Broughton's history. An institution whose walls absorbed so much genuine human suffering that even those who dismiss the ghost stories outright often admit to feeling something different when walking its oldest corridors, a weight that seems to settle into the building itself, independent of whatever explanation one chooses to believe. Chapter 10: Decline and Reckoning. The 1980s and 1990s brought a different kind of hardship to Broughton Hospital, one measured not in violence or scandal, but in the slow, grinding pressure of institutional survival. Across the country, psychiatric hospitals were facing increased scrutiny from regulatory bodies, rising standards for patient care, and mounting costs required simply to keep aging facilities operational and compliant. Broughton felt this pressure acutely. Oversight organizations demanded improvements that the hospital's budget could barely support, while the expenses of running a campus this large continued to climb, well beyond what the state was willing or able to provide. Severe budget problems became a defining feature of these 2 decades, forcing administrators into a constant, uncomfortable balancing act between patient care and financial survival. In December of 1992, in response to these mounting challenges, the Broughton Hospital Foundation was formed, an organization created specifically to enhance the lives of patients through donations, endowments, and community support that state funding alone could no longer guarantee. The foundation represented an acknowledgement that Broughton could no longer rely solely on the state to meet even its most basic needs, that the institution's survival and the well-being of the patient still living within its walls would depend increasingly on outside generosity and community involvement. It was a quiet admission of just how far the hospital's circumstances had drifted from the confident, well-funded optimism of its founding era more than a century earlier. Despite these hardships, Broughton continued its work, and today the hospital serves approximately 800 patients each year, supported by a staff of roughly 1,200 employees, operating on an annual budget of approximately $98 million. In 2011, facing continued financial pressure, the hospital began hiring temporary and contract staff as a way of controlling overhead costs, a practical if imperfect solution to the same budget constraints that had shaped so much of Broughton's recent history. Perhaps the most significant recent chapter in Broughton's story came in 2017, when the hospital completed construction on an entirely new facility, one built to house hospital departments and patient divisions under a single modern roof, situated on the same grounds that had held the institution since its founding in the 1800s. This new building represented something Broughton had never truly had in its long history: purpose-built modern infrastructure designed specifically around contemporary standards of psychiatric care. For patients and staff alike, the shift into this new facility marked a genuine turning point, an opportunity to practice modern psychiatric medicine within walls built for that exact purpose, free from the physical limitations that had shaped and constrained care for well over a century. The original Kirkbride-style main building, the very structure that had opened its doors back in 1883, did not disappear with this transition. Instead, it was preserved as a historical landmark, its long brick corridors and soaring windows repurposed as office space rather than patient wards. Recognized formally through its listing on the National Register of Historic Places, first for the main building itself in 1977, and later for the broader historic district encompassing the surrounding campus in 1987, the original Asylum building now exists in a strange kind of dual identity, a working piece of state infrastructure and a preserved monument to one of the oldest chapters in North Carolina's approach to mental health care. Walking its halls today, one finds administrative offices where wards once stood, quiet workspaces where hundreds of patients once lived out years, sometimes decades, of their lives. The building itself remains, its brick walls having outlasted the era that built it, the treatments once practiced within it, and even the name it carried for much of its history. What continues inside its walls today looks nothing like what its founders envisioned in 1883, yet the structure itself endures, a physical witness to every chapter of Broughton's long and complicated story, still standing at the edge of Morganton as new generations of patients and staff move through a modern facility built just beyond its shadow. Chapter 11: The Thin Line Between Hope and Suffering. Standing today at the edge of Morganton, the old Kirkbride building still catches the morning light the same way it did on the day it opened. Its brick has darkened with age, its windows have watched over more than 14 decades of human lives, and its halls now echo with the quiet footsteps of office workers rather than the crowded wards of a state hospital. Yet anyone who walks through its oldest corridors still describes that same unshakable stillness, a weight that seems to live in the walls themselves, independent of whoever happens to be passing through. It is easy, standing before Broughton's stately facade, to see only the promise its founders imagined, a monument to reform. It is harder, but perhaps more important, to also see everything that promise eventually gave way to, overcrowding that stretched physicians and nurses past any reasonable limit. Treatments once championed as modern medicine, later condemned as barbaric, alongside a hidden program of forced sterilization, carried out not through cruelty, but through quiet, bureaucratic conviction. A violent morning in 1971 that left 2 respected staff members dead behind a locked door, its true cause never fully explained. 2 sisters who died within the same hour, in different wards, for reasons medicine still cannot account for. Broughton's story does not offer a clean answer to why an institution built on such genuine hope could also become a place capable of so much quiet suffering. Perhaps that is because there is no clean answer. Perhaps the truth is simply that good intentions, however sincere, are never enough on their own, that dignity requires constant vigilance rather than a single founding vision, and that even the most beautifully designed building, with its wide corridors and sunlit windows meant to heal troubled minds, can still become a place where people are failed, forgotten, or lost entirely. What remains today is a structure caught between two identities, part historical landmark, part working office space, a building that has outlived nearly every era it once represented. The cemetery behind it holds more than 1,500 names, each one eventually restored after decades of anonymity. The new hospital beside it now practices a form of psychiatric care its founders could scarcely have imagined. Care rooted in dignity rather than confinement, in treatment rather than control. And yet, the old building still stands, silent and watchful, holding within its brick and plaster every version of Broughton that ever existed. The hopeful and the tragic, the reform-minded and the barbaric, the healed and the lost. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of a place like Broughton Hospital, a reminder that even our most well-intentioned institutions carry within them the potential for both remarkable compassion and profound harm, and that the line separating the two is often thinner and far more fragile than we would ever like to believe.